B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, December 4th, 2018. Last week, without explanation, CNN fired an African-American commentator, Professor Marc Lamont Hill. And it wasn't anything he said on CNN. CNN is joining the Israel lobby in trampling the First Amendment here in the United States. Professor Hill, as I mentioned, from Temple, where he is a tenured professor, gave a speech at the United Nations. He was invited there as a part of the special meeting of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, in observance of the UN International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, and he gave a speech where he spoke about the crisis between Israel and the Palestinians, and critics jumped on him for using the phrase, from the river to the sea, saying that he wanted the rights of Palestinians to be recognized throughout the Israeli area, including the occupied territories. And this was interpreted, falsely I believe, as anti-Semitic. And in short order, CNN terminated his agreement to serve as a commentator on the network, and it has produced a firestorm of criticism. And the professor did explain himself, as I'll get to in just a moment, but he has been forced to issue this apology. I take seriously the voices of so many Jewish brothers and sisters who have interpreted my remarks as a call to or endorsement of violence. Rather than hearing a political solution, many heard a dog whistle that conjured a long and deep history of violence against Jewish people. Although this was the furthest thing from my intent, those particular words clearly caused confusion, anger, fear, and other forms of harm. For that, I am deeply sorry. And Phil Giraldi, who you can always count on to tell it like it is, he published a piece at the AH Tribune. I haven't seen this outlet before. We've talked to Phil on many occasions. He served at the CIA, and he's more or less a libertarian, I would say. And he writes that Lamont Hill was fired for what he said in a speech, and that he called for a free Palestine from river to the sea. And this was immediately seized upon. New York Consul General Danny Dayan, denouncing Hill as a racist, a bigot, and an anti-Semite. He noted that Hill is under contract both with Temple and CNN, well, the CNN part no longer, implying that he should be punished by being fired, and called the remarks appalling. Hill's response, I support Palestinian freedom. I support Palestinian self-determination. I am deeply critical of Israeli policy and practice. I do not support anti-Semitism, killing Jewish people, or any of the other things attributed to my speech. So this is a dark day for the First Amendment in the United States. And in a moment, it's going to get a little darker. And continuing with Giraldi's commentary here, he said the lead political anchor, of course, at CNN is Wolf Blitzer, the former employee of the American-Israeli Political Action Committee. And I will note that Jeff Zucker, who runs CNN, does have a Jewish surname. I don't know if he identifies as an active practicing Jew, and I don't know his politics related to the State of Israel. But he would have signed off on the decision to fire Professor Marc Lamont Hill. Giraldi goes on that Professor Hill said nothing wrong. On the contrary, he said something badly needed, which should have been accepted by CNN if it were really a global communications network dedicated to the truth and, one might add, to justice. And Professor Cornel West, who is a longtime friend of Professor Hill, he weighs in a commentary that I've linked to in the show file for today's podcast, appearing in The Guardian. He said, many supporters of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, such as Hill and myself, see this strategy, BDS, as a last-ditch effort to avoid more bloodshed. This is especially important in the U.S. context, as $3 billion of military aid currently goes to Israel to support such an unjust and inhumane occupation. West continued, Hill's courageous UN speech was a gallant attempt to highlight the horrendous suffering of and callous indifference to the Palestinian people. Hill unsettled the toxic status quo and received its knee-jerk response. He was cast as an anti-Semite and promptly silenced from mainstream media. And for black critics of Israel, such attacks are especially dangerous, given the intimate and fraught history of black-Jewish relations in the U.S. and the tremendous status that black freedom fighters have around the world. More from West here. The most controversial moment of Hill's bold address was his call for a free Palestine from the river to the sea. For most Zionists and many others, these last words were cast as anti-Jewish, signifying the destruction of the Israeli state or even the genocide of Jews. These gross misunderstandings and misconstruals play upon the deep fears and memories of vicious attacks and ugly assaults on Jewish people. They are part of the core of what it means to be Jewish and must be respected. He goes on to say, on a personal note, after knowing or working closely with Hill for over 20 years, I'm certain that these words were neither a dog whistle nor an explicit call for genocide. The Israeli state will, like so many others, either continue along the path of authoritarianism and xenophobia, or it will embrace the dismantling of occupation, give full citizenship to Palestinians in Israel, and provide land justice in some form. The Intercept reporting today that senators are working in the lame duck session to attach to a must-pass budget bill the anti-boycott law. It's called the Israel Anti-Boycott Act, and it would penalize corporations and, in turn, individuals who support boycott, divestment, and sanctions aimed at Israel in an effort to get it to change its policies and practices. Now, the bill has been revised and watered down a little bit, we're told, but the ACLU is still strongly opposed, warning that the amended version still creates unconstitutional restrictions on free speech. We understand the Senate is considering attaching a revised version to the end-of-the-year omnibus spending bill, and we urge you to oppose its inclusion. Now, here is a profile in courage. Detroit has elected Rashida Tlaib. I have trouble with her name. It's spelled Tlaib. It's either Tlaib or Tlaib, and she is the second member of Congress to publicly endorse BDS. And I give her a lot of credit. She's also planning to lead a delegation next year to educate members of the House on conditions in the West Bank. I think this woman has a lot of courage. And we note that 25 states have already enacted laws punishing businesses that choose to boycott Israel. And this federal bill would be a major incursion on our constitutional rights. So I really appreciate the Congresswoman-elect's approach to this and her courage in firmly standing up for BDS. And Tlaib is also planning to lead this delegation. Now, you may or may not know that it is common for newly elected fresh men and fresh women members of Congress to spend next August on a junket to Israel, sponsored by AIPAC. And she is going to lead a delegation to the West Bank. She's the first Palestinian-American woman elected to Congress, and she hopes that other people will join her. It's a new idea, so I don't think there is a sign-up list so far. But she has been joined in her pro-BDS position by the newly elected Congresswoman from Minnesota. I believe she took Keith Ellison's seat, Ilhan Omar, a Democrat who has stood up and said publicly that she supports BDS. To the president's tweets yesterday, where he demonized Michael Cohen and urged that he serve his full prison sentence, and then praised Roger Stone, who has promised not to testify against Trump if the Mueller investigation tries to squeeze him. Well, the president tweeted a quote of Roger Stone, "I will never testify against Trump." That was quoted. And then he said, this statement was recently made by Roger Stone, essentially stating that he will not be forced by a rogue and out-of-control prosecutor to make up lies and stories about, quote, President Trump. Nice to know that some people still have guts. And get this, one of the first critics of that is Mr. Kellyanne Conway. George Conway tweeted, or he stated, I'm not sure it was a tweet, that this appears to violate a section of the U.S. Code that makes it a federal crime to corruptly persuade a witness with the intent to influence or prevent that witness's testimony in a criminal proceeding. Dan Goldman, former U.S. Attorney in Southern District of New York, having prosecuted mob bosses, it's unfair to compare them to Trump. Mob bosses are far smarter and way more savvy and discreet than Trump. And Neil Katyal, a Democrat and Supreme Court lawyer who has teamed up with Conway on some op-eds recently, said George is right. This is genuinely looking like witness tampering. The fact that it's done out in the open is no defense. And Republican legal commentator Ken White, also called Pope Hat, I encountered him when he wrote some commentaries about our friend Roger Schuler when he was bogusly incarcerated in Alabama. Anyway, White is quoted as saying, though it's very hard to prove this is witness tampering, it's absolutely norm violating, and if a CEO or mob boss or other authority figure did it, the feds would absolutely crawl up their ass and look for a way to charge them for it. So this is just more outrageous and brazen behavior by Trump. He is daring the Democrats. He is acting with impunity because he knows that Nancy Pelosi has taken impeachment off the table. And I continue to argue that even if the Democrats don't ultimately vote in the House to impeach Trump, an investigation is a place where the Mueller report could be subpoenaed from, and it would give them a way to put the president on guard and prevent more of this outrageous behavior. Last week, as we talked about yesterday, The Guardian issued a report, and it's being tweaked by both the New York Times and the Washington Post because no one has joined The Guardian in its fanciful report that Paul Manafort, the later campaign manager for Trump, made 3 visits to the Embassy of Ecuador in London to chat with Julian Assange. And now the New York Times, while dismissing that marginalized report, tells us that Paul Manafort in May of 2017 was so desperate for cash that he was flying all over the place trying to line up new grisly clients. He's a political mercenary, as his past clients like Yanukovych in Ukraine would be evidence of. And so he went to Ecuador to meet with the newly elected president Lenin Moreno. And he mainly, at least we're told by the leaks here, he went there to see if he could broker a deal between China and Ecuador for an investment in Ecuador's power grid. But the talks turned to a diplomatic sticking point between the U.S. and Ecuador, the fate of Julian Assange. In at least 2 meetings with Manafort, Moreno and his aides discussed their desire to rid themselves of Assange. They said Manafort suggested he could help negotiate a deal for the handover of Assange to the United States, and then, Robert Mueller was appointed the special counsel, and his talks with Ecuador ended without any deals. And the Times reports that, where else did he go? He pitched officials from a range of governments facing a variety of challenges, from Puerto Rico to Ecuador to Iraqi Kurdistan to the United Arab Emirates. He's a man with flexible ethics, just needed cash. And apparently none of that panned out for him. I want to recommend that you read a piece by Andrew McCarthy. I don't ordinarily quote things from the National Review, but you can't get honest commentary from the liberal media in this country about the Trump-Russia investigation. And McCarthy makes a good case that Robert Mueller is not building for a criminal prosecution. He is writing his report that will be presented to Matthew Whitaker, the new Attorney General, who, as I describe, is the goalie who will prevent the report from reaching the goal. And so this guy McCarthy takes on some of the central issues, and he says, look, by prosecuting all these people for lying and not prosecuting them about the crimes that they allegedly lied about, Mueller is gathering information. And relevant to the claims of collusion, McCarthy argues Mueller does not have a crime that he's investigating. He's investigating in hopes of finding one. And while collusion pours off every page of the narrative statements that Mueller submitted in the cases of Papadopoulos and Cohen, Well, Mueller did not charge them as crimes because, McCarthy argues, they're not crimes. They just lied about stuff. So he makes 3 points here. First, Mueller is not going to indict the president. Second, the false statement pleas create the illusion of a collusion crime and thus appear to vindicate Mueller's sprawling investigation. And third, defendants convicted of making false statements are very useful because Mueller is writing a report, not preparing for a jury trial. If you can stand it, I encourage you to read that commentary. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Great people like Paul Lacombe, Jeffrey Lipinski, Paul Elsesser, who, by the way, is all safe from the Camp Fire in Northern California, and Susan Vian, who just renewed her annual subscription. Thank you, Susan. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I invite you to become a supporter of this podcast. All you have to do is go to peterbcollins.com, find the menu tab, then click on Become a Subscriber. You land on the sign-up page where it's easy to choose $5, $10, $20 a month. Our $50 annual subscription earns you a bonus gift, a copy of John Dist's new rock and roll CD called American University. And if you're allergic to PayPal, you can always write to me at Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. I want to encourage you to read this latest column by New York Times writer Maureen Dowd. It's called Curtains for the Clintons, and as you may know, they've embarked, Bill and Hillary together, on a stadium tour to engage with their rabid fans and extract more cash from them. So the opening event, for some reason, was in Toronto at the Scotiabank Arena, and Maureen Dowd writes from the empty bleachers there that it's 2 for 1. They have condensed the arena by putting up curtains over half of it. They're scrambling at the last minute to sell tickets, some for under $10. And she writes, I can't fathom why the Clintons would make like aging rock stars and go on a tour of Canada and the U.S. at a moment when Democrats are hoping to break the stranglehold of their cloistered, superannuated leadership and exult in a mosaic of exciting new faces. What is the point? It's not inspirational. It's not for charity. They're not raising awareness like Al Gore with global warming. They're only raising awareness about the Clintons. It can't be about the money. Have they even spent all the Goldman gold yet? Do they want to swim in their cash like Scrooge McDuck? The Clintons' tin cup is worthy of the Smithsonian, Dowd continues. They hoovered up more than $2 billion in contributions to their campaigns, foundations, and philanthropies. After the White House, the money-grubbing raged on, with the Clintons making over 700 speeches in a 15-year period, blithely unconcerned with any appearance of avarice or of shady special interests in foreign countries buying influence. They stockpiled a whopping $240 million. Even leading to the presidential run Hillary was packing in the speeches, including the trifecta for Goldman Sachs. Later, Dowd writes, some in Clinton world say Hillary fully intends to be the nominee next time. Once more in Toronto, she didn't rule it out, dodging the question with a lame joke. And her consigliere, Philippe Reines, has prodded reporters to include her name when they write about the 2020 candidates. And Dowd, getting ready to close, says Bill was radioactive in the midterms and Hillary was the ghost of Christmas past. Her approval rating is at a record low 36%. The only American who seems truly interested in her these days is President Trump, who can't stop tweeting about her. She's still money in his book. The Clintons refuse to be discarded. It has been their joint project for half a century to be at the center of the public scene and debate. The way that whole thing came crashing down in 2016 is too hard for them to bear. They would like to rewrite the ending, but there is no way to do that. Their pathological need to be relevant in America is belied by a Canadian arena where stretches of empty seats bear witness to the passing of their relevance. It's a pity, says Maureen Dowd. And I'm sure Bill Clinton and Donald Trump are breathing a sigh of relief today as a last-minute settlement in a civil suit in Florida shuts down the possibility that the victims of Jeffrey Epstein will testify, at least for now. And we know that Bill Clinton and Donald Trump both attended parties where Jeffrey Epstein played with young girls, many of whom were recruited for him. And this, of course, is a big scandal that could blow up for both Trump and for Clinton. They took rides on his jet, went to his private island, and Trump was reported at parties in New York that Epstein threw, and has been accused by an alleged victim of violating her when she was underage. So we know that Epstein got a sweetheart plea deal from Alex Acosta, who is now the Secretary of Labor, and the cover-up is holding to date. Hey, here's a shocker for you. The campaign arm of a major party has reported that its servers were hacked by an unknown intruder. It's not known if a foreign government was behind the intrusion into the computer networks of the National Republican Congressional Committee. But it was a sophisticated hack based on their tactics and methods. It was clearly designed to hide the tracks of who it was. The NRCC can confirm that it was the victim of a cyber intrusion by an unknown entity, and when they discovered the breach in April, they kept it quiet. They did report it to the FBI within days, and get this, they hired CrowdStrike, the same fabulous firm with ties to the FBI that investigated the DNC servers after they were hacked. They didn't learn anything from that episode? Oh, that's bizarre. RT reports that last week more than a dozen FBI agents searched for 6 hours at the house of a contractor, a whistleblower who had given Congress and the Justice Department documents about the Clinton Foundation and the Uranium Scandal, and that this implicates former FBI Director Robert Mueller, St. Bob. On November 19th, it wasn't last week, pardon me, 16 agents showed up at the Maryland home of Dennis Nathan Kane. They demanded to see the documents Kane had already turned over to the Justice Department Inspector General and the House and Senate Intelligence Committee. And the man's lawyer, Michael Sokara, said, "I can't believe the Bureau informed the federal magistrate who approved this warrant that they wanted to search the home of an FBI whistleblower to seize the information that he confidentially disclosed to the Inspector General and Congress." Now, here's where we get speculative. Because what were they looking for? Well, they were after a document, this report from RT says, suggesting that Robert Mueller failed to investigate allegations of criminal misconduct in the Uranium case. Now, that's the Canadian mining company that controls 20% of the U.S. uranium supply. It was sold to a Russian conglomerate in 2010, and then Bill Clinton got $500,000 for a speech in Moscow related to that same firm. I've always thought this was a stinky deal, and I do believe it deserves further scrutiny. But was this raid an effort to grab the evidence, to prevent further investigation, to prevent sullying the reputation of Bob Mueller for failing to investigate that while he was the FBI director? Those are questions, and at the moment I don't have the answers. But here's a guy who appears to know much more than I do. Big J emailed me yesterday. And prepare for omniscience here, friends, all right? He writes, "After taking a month break from your show after years of listening, I see that you are missing the real story. You've been right about the zero evidence that Trump colluded with Russia. You may have been right about the pay-to-play Clinton Foundation. But the Uranium deal is but the tip of the iceberg. I don't really have time to fill you in on the last year worth of stuff, but looking on YouTube for QAnon will get lots of real good info. Sorry, Big J, I don't trust QAnon and I don't traffic in their stuff." Anyway, he says, long story short, the biggest law enforcement crackdown is coming. All the corrupt heads of FBI and DOJ, lots of the deep state, are fixing to be arrested and sent to Gitmo. I didn't become a Trump supporter till a few months ago, he confesses. Why? Because he really is going to rid us of all these globalists, corruption, and treason. Don't miss the biggest story in our generation. Gitmo was refurbished and online a few months ago. The 305th Military Police are deploying there now. The huge amount of sealed indictments, 60,000 plus, are fixing to be unsealed. If all goes well, the Clintons, Obama, Bush, and the rest of them should be in orange jumpsuits before the end of the year. It's going to start right after this week's hearings and testimony in the House. Time to get on the right side of the story. Signed, J. Well, we've been warned. 60,000? That's Turkish. Turkish in its scope. North Carolina is the scene of election controversy where there may have been some voter fraud run by a campaign guru hired by many people for local get-out-the-vote efforts. And this relates to the race between Republican Mark Harris and Democrat Dan McCready for the House of Representatives in the 9th Congressional District. There are at least, what's the number here? Hundreds of ballots in a race that was decided by 1,388 votes in favor of the Republican. We are told that sworn affidavits suggest that absentee ballots were manipulated and falsified, and that the signatures that were placed on them, the witnesses showed up on dozens of different ballots. So there's an investigation underway, and there are local rumors that the guy who handled this, whose name is Dowless, he was going to get a bonus if the sheriff got reelected. And so it's a kind of convoluted case. But it has led Steny Hoyer, who will be the number 2 leader in the House come January, to say that there appears to be a very substantial question on the integrity of the election, and we would oppose the seating of Mr. Harris in the House until that is resolved. So this conflict will continue. Over in Wisconsin, the struggle goes on. As we referenced yesterday, the lame duck Republican-controlled legislature is trying to ram through bills that Scott Walker can sign before he is forced out of office at the end of his term. And in Wisconsin, they are trying to limit the power of the next governor, whose name is Evers, I think Tony Evers, and also the Attorney General. And this is an effort to preserve the conservative policies that have been imposed over the last 10 years. And the Dems are especially incensed about a bill that would allow legislative leaders to assign private lawyers to replace the Attorney General on certain lawsuits, so that if there are attacks on Republican legislation from the past, the Republicans would be able to hire their own lawyer and bypass the Attorney General. In Washington today, the director of the CIA briefed leading senators about the death of Jamal Khashoggi. It was a closed session in the basement of the Capitol as Bloody Gina Haspel, the CIA director, came and made comments about the various allegations and the level of proof that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was directly responsible for ordering the death of Khashoggi at the Istanbul consulate of the Saudi government. So this is an attempt to appease Lindsey Graham, who had vowed to freeze Trump administration legislative priorities until she appeared and spoke to the Senate. But Rand Paul was not pleased. He said this arrangement, the secret hearing or briefing, epitomizes the deep state. The deep state wants to keep everyone in the dark, he wrote. This is just ridiculous. And today the stock market was dropping. It's about to close as I'm speaking to you now, but it dropped more than 600 points because the investors figured out that yesterday's exuberance over Trump's claims of a deal with China reached at the G20 summit in Buenos Aires fell apart. He's full of shit, that's why. I'm sorry to be so blunt, but that's what it is. So today he roiled the markets, Trump, by tweeting, "President Xi and I want this deal to happen. It probably will, but if not, remember, I am a tariff man. When people or countries come in to raid the great wealth of our nation, I want them to pay for the privilege of doing so." Well, this has put more uncertainty into the markets, and we're seeing German auto executives scramble to come to a meeting in Washington today. Their effort will be to persuade the government that they'll create more jobs for American workers if the tariffs are rolled back or eliminated. Trump wants to put tariffs of 25% on imported cars. And the automakers are clearly puzzled because they need stable plans as they make the transition to more electric cars and away from gas-powered vehicles. And the tariff war has already caused General Motors to make huge cutbacks. So the auto industry is struggling to get clarity from Trump. In France, Emmanuel Macron has blinked. After the riots by the people in the yellow vests, he announced that he will suspend the gasoline tax that triggered it. And I do have empathy for the people of France. Gasoline is more expensive there than anywhere I have ever been. And in what may be a well-intentioned effort to try to reduce carbon emissions by charging more for gasoline, the gas tax increase of 25 cents a gallon was supposed to kick in January, and that will not be happening. And finally today, I was pleased to see in my local newspaper, this is a little paper called the Marin Independent Journal, a mainstream media reporter has cataloged some of the real crazy bullshit that has been promoted on Facebook and on YouTube videos since the recent wave of wildfires in California. And some of the theories are that the fires were ignited by a secret cabal of nefarious internationalists, including Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg and Google's Sergey Brin. There are hidden powers behind these calculated strikes in California, warns a YouTube video. On Facebook, believers swap manipulated images of light pillars from the sky, proof that rural homes were targeted to burn, forcing residents into cities where they can be more easily controlled by shadowy forces. And the reporter decided to cite the aptly named psychologist from Harvard named Joseph Vitriol. Vitriol says, whether it's wildfires, contamination of water supplies, or some deep state takeover, all these beliefs satisfy the need to make sense of a threatening and anxious world. And the other claims were that geoengineering and directed energy weapons, fires were ignited by drones or satellite-based lasers. And I'm sorry, but the evidence is clear where these fires originated. One of them in Southern California, the Woolsey Fire, is believed to have been started at the Santa Susana federal facility, which is an abandoned rocket fuel and nuclear test site in the Santa Monica Mountains. And we even have people in the fire zone. A Paradise resident named Cheryl described seeing a huge corporate helicopter circling over my house, surveying the town, getting ready to grasp it. So it's fair to say that while I'm willing to explore all kinds of theories, even looking at the dark side of our government, it amazes me to see the imaginations and the conspiratorial thinking that infects the minds of so many people.
We are trying to contain this.
Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it far and wide. You'll find it on YouTube. And I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling